My soon-to-be ex-wife cheated on me with my brother and wants me to pay child support. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I guess the simplest way to describe myself is I used to think I understood loyalty. My father taught me early on that you look after family, you stand by them no matter what, and in return, they do the same for you. That was the foundation of how I lived for most of my life. I grew up in a small Midwest town, just your average American kid, running around with my brother and trying to impress my father with every small achievement. My mother was always busy working, but she was the soft heart of our home, always telling us to stick together. For years, I believed that no one could drive a wedge between us. As I got older, I met my wife in a neighboring town through a mutual friend. We had that typical small-town love story. After a few months of dating, we decided we could conquer anything if we worked together. We got married, thinking we were signing up for a lifetime of camaraderie and unwavering devotion. At first, it felt like we were unstoppable. Maybe we were too young, or maybe we just thought we knew more than we actually did. Either way, we tied the knot, forging forward on what I assumed would be a journey built on trust. Things started to shift about a year ago, but I could never put my finger on the exact moment it all began to unravel. My wife and I had arguments, nothing unusual in a marriage, but every disagreement felt heavier, like the weight of something bigger was pressing down on us. She started spending more time going out with her friends, and she insisted she needed space to clear her head. I tried to be supportive, but the distance between us was almost tangible. Our conversations became strained, limited to small talk or polite inquiries about how our days went. I told myself marriages have rough patches, and I clung to the hope we'd rediscover our spark. One evening, I remember coming home from work and seeing my wife standing in the kitchen. She had tears in her eyes, but not the kind that show pain, more like guilt. I asked if everything was okay, and she assured me she was just tired. It was a flimsy explanation, but I let it go. Deep down, something twisted in my gut, warning me that we were on the brink of a painful revelation. I just couldn't see clearly what it would be. A few weeks later, my wife said she was meeting with my brother for lunch to discuss something related to our extended family's property. My brother managed some real estate ventures and always prided himself on being the go-to guy for any kind of land or property advice. I didn't think much of it at first. It made sense that he might want her input if it involved me. But something about the way she told me, her voice a bit too quick, her eyes darting away, made my heart thump. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, this was my brother, the guy who chased me around a yard as a kid, the person who taught me how to throw a decent curveball. Why would I suspect anything out of line? From that point on, though, strange details piled up. My wife became protective of her phone, always setting it face down. Once, I saw an incoming message at a glance, and it was from my brother. She saw me glance over, snatched up the device, and hurried into the other room. It bothered me, but I tried to swallow my doubt. She could have been planning some big surprise or maybe needed personal advice from him. I was looking for any rational reason, anything that would let me keep trusting them both. As time went on, I sensed that everything was building to a breaking point. My mother pulled me aside one day at a family dinner, asking why I seemed so tense around my brother. I pretended like I didn't know what she was talking about, but I hated lying to her. I hated lying to myself, too. There was some intangible wedge forming. My wife would disappear on errands for hours, and my brother gave me forced smiles whenever we ran into each other at family gatherings. It was as if they both were keeping a secret wrapped in layers of polite pretense. Then came the day that everything clicked. My wife announced she was pregnant. At first, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions, confusion, followed by a flicker of joy, then a surge of dread. We hadn't really been intimate in a while. Too many arguments, too much tension. A part of me still wanted to celebrate the idea of being a father, but something gnawed at me. When she told me, she seemed oddly subdued, like she was waiting for an explosion or a meltdown. I tried to be supportive and told her we'd figure it out, but behind closed doors, I was choking on anxiety. A week or two later, I received a phone call from one of our mutual friends, someone who was close to my wife. She seemed hesitant at first, but she said she couldn't let me walk around in the dark any longer. She admitted that my wife and my brother had been seeing each other behind my back for months. The friend told me they were worried because my wife was considering telling me the baby was mine, even though she'd privately confided that it might be my brother's. My hand went cold around the phone, and everything inside me lurched. The friend apologized, said she felt sick carrying the secret, and then hung up. That was the moment my world tore open. I thought about the late-night texts, the lunches that ran too long, the property discussion that never seemed to end. It all added up. My brother, flesh and blood, betrayed me and my wife. I couldn't even comprehend how she could look me in the eye each day. My head spun with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. I wanted to confront them both instantly, but I forced myself to wait and gather some proof. If I went in half-cocked, they deny everything and twist the narrative. So I decided to keep my distance and watch. I didn't let on that, I knew. I quietly got in touch with an attorney and explained that I suspected infidelity and I might need a paternity test to confirm if the baby was actually mine. The attorney gave me a rundown of how this typically goes in the courts. If the child was legally presumed mine at birth, I'd be on the hook for child support unless I contest a paternity in time. That knowledge made me sick. The idea that my wife and my brother could orchestrate a situation where I'd be legally responsible for their child was beyond comprehension. But it also fueled me. I wasn't going to roll over and let them ruin my life. I had to play this carefully. I started documenting every suspicious interaction, screenshots of text messages when I could glimpse them, noting down times and dates when she claimed to be with friends but was likely with him. I wanted an airtight case if this ended up in a brutal divorce. My wife kept up her facade of normalcy, or at least she tried, but I saw the guilt in her eyes. Sometimes I wondered if she felt remorse or just feared being caught. Eventually, the tension grew too thick to ignore. My wife demanded we talk about our future. She insisted that we needed to secure finances for the baby, maybe move to a bigger place. I asked her point blank, "Are you sure this baby is mine?" She turned pale, then got defensive, accusing me of not trusting her. That's when the anger almost boiled over, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told her that before we made any decisions, I wanted a paternity test. She burst into tears, calling me paranoid and cruel. Yet she never outright said, "Yes, the child is absolutely yours." A few days later, when I was at my parents' house, my brother walked in. The second I saw him, every muscle in my body tensed. He gave me this sideways look like he knew I was onto him. I asked him if there was something he needed to tell me. He stammered, acted confused, then said, "What are you talking about?" My father stepped in, sensing the hostility. I held back because I didn't want to blow up in front of my parents without solid evidence. I left the house soon after, silently vowing that I'd get the truth out one way or another. Inside, I was grappling with emotions, betrayal, rage, disbelief. The fact that my wife was pregnant only added a sense of urgency. If I didn't move quickly, I'd be labeled the father on the birth certificate by default. The idea that these two people I once loved could burden me with a child that might not even be mine was a blow to the core of my being. I was determined to fight, but I also needed to be cautious. If I lost control and acted rashly, my brother would spin it to make me look like the unstable party. Still, I felt the adrenaline pumping. I wanted justice. I wanted them to pay for destroying my faith and family. My brother had always been arrogant, but I never thought he'd sink this low. My wife, well, the mere thought of her now made me feel sick. I was furious, but heartbreak still lingered beneath the anger. She had once been my partner, someone I believed I could trust with my life. That trust was gone, replaced by a determination to make sure they faced the consequences of every entitled, manipulative choice they had made. In the days that followed, I laid the groundwork for what I knew would be an explosive confrontation. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney and laid it all out. The suspicion of adultery, the potential child that might not be mine, and my plan to contest paternity if necessary. My attorney explained the timeline. Under our state's laws, if my wife gave birth while we were still legally married, the child would be presumed mine unless I challenged it within a specific window. That window was short, so I had to act fast. I felt my pulse pounding when the attorney explained how courts tend to default to keeping the marital father on the hook for child support. It was a sobering realization. My wife's sense of entitlement in assuming I just foot the bill, while she snuck around with my brother, infuriated me. But the attorney also gave me hope, stating that if I could provide evidence of the affair and secure a DNA test, the court might remove any obligation for me to pay. In other words, if the child wasn't mine, I'd have a path to freedom. That night, I confronted my wife with the paternity test paperwork. I laid it out on the dining table. She was startled, tried to act outraged, but her eyes gave her away. She stammered something about how I was humiliating her, how I was showing no faith in our marriage. I told her calmly that she'd given me no reason to trust her, and that the only way to resolve this was through the test. I was ready to hear a confession, but she just clammed up. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "You can't just walk away from your responsibilities. Even if you hate me right now, you're still going to be financially responsible for this baby." Her tone was so cold, so resolute, like she'd already decided she'd milk me for child support no matter what. It felt like a knife to the gut. I told her that if I turned out to be the father, I wouldn't run from my responsibilities, but I also warned her that if she was lying, I'd make sure the truth came out in court. We didn't speak for the rest of the evening. She stayed in the bedroom. I stayed on the couch. The entire house felt like a war zone. Early the next morning, she packed a bag and left. I had a strong hunch she went straight to my brother. The worst part was that I kept questioning myself. Maybe I should have tried to talk it out more. Maybe I should have demanded she come clean. But deep down, I knew none of that would help. She was adamant about burying the secret, or at least controlling the narrative to her advantage. While she was gone, I spent time gathering every piece of evidence I could. I also looked into a private investigator, someone who could possibly catch them together. But the more I considered it, the more I realized that might not be necessary if the paternity test gave me the ammunition I needed. My attorney told me we could also file for a divorce on grounds of adultery, but the burden of proof could be high. Still, I knew that a paternity test revealing the child wasn't mine would be pretty damning proof of infidelity. I felt torn. Part of me wanted an immediate divorce, while another part wanted the ultimate revenge to be methodical, airtight, and entirely on my terms. A couple of days later, I got an unexpected visit from my father. He knocked on my door, face lined with concern. As soon as I let him in, he asked me what was going on between me, my wife, and my brother. He said that my wife had told him I was accusing her of unthinkable things, and that my brother was claiming I'd lost my mind. I could see the hurt in my father's eyes. He truly didn't know whom to believe. I calmly explained everything: the suspicious behavior, the pregnancy timing, the tip from our mutual friend, and my demand for a paternity test. My father didn't say much. He just listened, brow furrowed, occasionally shaking his head like he couldn't fathom any of this being true. Finally, he said, "I want to believe my sons wouldn't do this to each other. But if it's true, we need to settle this properly." Later that afternoon, my father arranged for a family sit-down at my parent house. I refused at first, thinking it might turn into a meltdown, but I realized it could be my chance to corner both my wife and my brother in front of someone who deserved the truth. My mother was there, too, wringing her hands in distress. When my wife and my brother arrived, they immediately tried to look outraged, like I was the villain in some twisted scenario. My wife claimed I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid and letting my jealousy get the better of me. My brother tried to stay quiet, but occasionally threw in little remarks about me overreacting. That's when I slammed the paternity test documents onto the table. I said, "Explain why my wife refuses to take this simple test if she's so certain I'm the father." You could hear a pin drop. My wife's face went pale, and my brother looked away. My mother asked them directly, "Is there any truth to what he's saying?" They stuttered, tried to say I was being abusive and controlling. I laughed dryly, though I kept my composure as best I could, and told them the court wouldn't see it that way once I filed for divorce on grounds of adultery. My father stood up, voice trembling, and told them both that he wanted an honest answer. My wife broke first. She started sobbing, saying it was all a mistake, that she'd been confused, that it only happened once or twice, and she regretted it. My brother glared at her, furious that she'd basically confessed. He tried to claim it was an accident, something that just happened. I asked them point blank if the baby was mine or his. Silence. With that, I knew enough. I announced my intention to file for divorce, and if the child turned out to be my brother's, I'd be contesting any claim of responsibility. My mother broke down crying, and my father looked shell-shocked. My wife grabbed my arm, pleading, "You can't leave me like this. I need you." The irony was so thick, it almost strangled me. She needed me, yet she'd run to my own brother in the dark. I brushed her hand away. The next day, I followed through. I visited my attorney, initiated divorce proceedings citing adultery, and requested a formal paternity test through the courts. My wife was served the papers within days. The fireworks began immediately. My wife started calling and texting nonstop, accusing me of destroying her life. My brother sent me messages that bordered on threatening, telling me I better not drag our family name through the mud. Yet there they were, the real culprits, demanding that I just roll over. The entitlement was staggering. A week later, I got a phone call from my mother, sobbing that my wife had shown up at their house begging for help. My father wasn't having it. He'd had enough of the lies. He told her to leave until the paternity test was resolved. For the first time in my life, I felt my father was choosing me over my brother's manipulations, but it came at the cost of tearing our family apart. My father's voice on the phone was heavy with regret, but he said he couldn't condone what had happened. Meanwhile, I could sense the desperation in my wife. Her texts shifted from anger to pleading for a compromise. She claimed she'd do anything to work it out. The nerve of that request stung me. Work it out? With my brother's child possibly on the way. Then came the dirty trick. She threatened to tell the court that I was an unfit spouse, that I'd been emotionally neglectful, possibly even violent. Of course, it was all lies, but I recognized her tactic. She was trying to intimidate me into backing down. My brother, not to be outdone, pulled another entitled stunt. He showed up at my work, unannounced, telling me that if I dragged him into a court battle, he claimed that I was the aggressor and that he only slept with my wife because I was neglecting her. He threatened to ruin my reputation in our community. That day, I almost lost control, but I kept my cool and told him to get off the property before I called security. I decided that if they wanted to play dirty, I'd prepare even more thoroughly. I documented his visit, filed a brief report about the incident in case he tried anything else. My attorney advised me to keep everything in writing to protect myself. All of this chaos was building toward an inevitable explosion. I felt my resentment burning like a wildfire, but I also recognized I had to stay focused. If I let anger dictate my moves, they'd exploit that in court. So I stayed methodical. I cooperated fully with the paternity test, submitted everything on time, and made sure my attorney had copies of all relevant documents, including text messages that hinted at the affair. My wife kept resisting the test, delaying it with excuses, but legally she couldn't avoid it forever. I was counting down the days until we had the results in black and white. In the midst of all this, I sometimes wondered, was I chasing revenge or simply seeking justice? But every time I recalled the smug look on my brother's face, or my wife's entitled demand that I pay for a baby that might be his, I realized they had earned every bit of the blowback heading their way. They had lied, manipulated, and expected me to shoulder the consequences. That kind of betrayal deserved a reckoning, and I was preparing to deliver it. The paternity test day arrived. My wife tried to postpone, but the court order was clear. She had to comply. I showed up with my attorney, and my wife arrived alone, looking both furious and anxious. She barely made eye contact. We both submitted our samples, and then it was a matter of waiting. The tension hung thick in the air. I left the facility feeling like my entire life was in limbo. If the test said the child was mine, I'd be locked into a custody battle with a woman who betrayed me in the worst way. If it wasn't, I could cut ties more easily, but I'd still have to deal with the emotional wreckage of discovering my brother was the real father. During that waiting period, my brother kept trying to control the narrative, telling extended family that I was fabricating drama, that my wife and I were having marital issues, and that I was just looking to blame someone. Some relatives reached out, confused by all the rumors. I decided not to air every detail to them, but I made it clear something very serious had happened. My father and mother stayed mostly silent. I think they were both trying to grapple with the idea that one son had betrayed the other so completely. Finally, the results came in. My attorney called me in and handed me the envelope. He said, "Do you want to open it here or at home?" My heart was pounding. I opted to open it right there in front of him. The test concluded, with near certainty, that I was not the father. Even though I'd suspected it, seeing it spelled out on paper jolted me like a sucker punch. There it was. The child my wife carried was biologically my brother's, not mine. A wave of relief, anger, and heartache surged through me all at once. Relief that I wouldn't be trapped financially. Anger at the extent of their betrayal. Heartache because, despite everything, there was a tiny part of me that had hoped to be a dad, just not under these circumstances. My attorney assured me that these results would heavily support my divorce case and free me from any child support obligations. He also advised me to finalize the divorce as soon as possible to avoid any complications at the birth. That same day, I called a meeting with my father, mother, my brother, and my wife. I wanted them all in the same room to face the results. My wife tried to protest, probably fearing the public shaming, but I insisted. My father didn't argue, though I could see the heartbreak in his eyes. We gathered in my parents' living room. My brother was already there when I arrived, sitting stiffly in a chair. My mother sat on the couch, clutching a tissue, while my father stood in the corner, arms crossed. My wife arrived last, looking like she'd rather vanish than endure this. I handed my father the envelope with the official test results. As he read the contents, I heard his breath catch. My mother looked up, searching his face for a clue. Then he silently handed the papers to her. She started crying, tears streaming down her cheeks as she took it all in. My wife shifted nervously, then blurted out, "I didn't want it to go this far. We never meant to hurt anyone." My brother swallowed hard, trying to look impassive but failing. I kept my voice steady, addressing them all. "The paternity test shows I'm not the father. This means my soon-to-be ex-wife is carrying my brother's child. I have proof of their affair, and I'm divorcing her on grounds of adultery." I fixed my gaze on my wife. "You won't get a cent from me. Not for you, not for the baby. If you try, I'll produce this evidence in court. I'll make sure you face the consequences." She just stammered about being sorry, as if that would erase months of secret meetings. My brother tried to argue that this situation was complicated, that he wasn't sure if he could take on the role of a parent. The entitlement in his tone made me furious. He'd helped create this mess, and now he wanted to dodge responsibility? I told him, "You reap what you sow. Don't look at me to fix your problems anymore." He started to protest, but I cut him off, reminding him that he'd threatened me at my workplace to keep quiet. My father listened, stunned, as I recounted that little intimidation stunt. My mother cried even harder. The whole scene was raw, uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done. My wife sank to the couch, burying her face in her hands. My brother stood up, pacing, muttering that this was all a huge mistake. My father finally broke his silence, voice trembling. "How could you two do this to our family? This is your brother, your husband. What were you thinking?" Nobody had a good answer. My father's anger turned to my brother, telling him he needed to grow up and face the responsibility. My brother didn't have a response, just offered mumbled excuses about being confused and lonely. I felt a pang of bitterness that he could belittle my marriage and cheat behind my back just because he was lonely. After that, the meeting dissolved into chaotic attempts at damage control. My wife apologized repeatedly, but I had no interest in hearing it. My brother claimed he'd make it right, though he couldn't say how. My mother pulled me aside, pleading with me to consider counseling or mediation, anything that might keep the family from completely fracturing. I told her calmly that this was beyond repair. I was done being the doormat for their entitlement. Over the next few days, my wife bombarded me with texts, saying she had nowhere to go, no resources, and that I was cruel for leaving her pregnant and alone. That only fueled my resolve. She and my brother had stabbed me in the back, yet they expected me to be their safety net? Absolutely not. I blocked her number and started packing my belongings to move to a new place. The attorney recommended I keep my distance until the divorce was finalized, so that's exactly what I did. Legally, the process moved faster than I expected. With proof of adultery and the paternity test, my case was strong. My wife, or rather soon-to-be ex-wife, attempted to drag it out, claiming she needed spousal support, but my attorney countered that her infidelity was the reason for the dissolution. The judge, as far as my attorney believed, wouldn't look kindly on someone who tried to force an innocent spouse to pay child support for a baby conceived through adultery. Still, nothing is guaranteed in court, and I stayed vigilant. I didn't want them pulling any last-minute stunts that might complicate the outcome. My brother sent me a single text saying, "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. I'd spent enough of my life being the good brother, the supportive one. He'd taken my kindness and used it as an opportunity to sabotage my marriage. If he wanted to salvage a relationship, he should have thought about that before sleeping with my wife. With everything in motion, I planned my next steps carefully. There was a final hearing scheduled in a few weeks. My wife seemed desperate, but as of now, there was little she could do. The day before the hearing, I got a call from my father, who said, "Son, I know this is your fight, but your mother and I want you to know we support you. We'll be there if you need us." I felt a wave of gratitude that, at the very least, my parents saw which side of the line I stood on. My father said my brother had been trying to apologize, but the damage was done. They were disappointed and angry, and they told him he needed to handle the child's situation on his own. It was good to know I had some support, even though I was still reeling from the betrayal. At that point, I wasn't just aiming for a legal separation. I wanted to ensure they never took advantage of me again. I wanted a clean break, free of any obligations to a child that wasn't mine, and free of the toxic entanglements that my wife and brother had created. It was the only path forward for me, the only way to reclaim my sense of dignity after being dragged through this nightmare. A part of me acknowledged that my thirst for revenge was strong. But it was more than that. It was about justice. They had wronged me and shown zero remorse, except when they feared getting caught. Now, they had to face the consequences of their entitlement and deceit. I was ready to see it through to the end. On the day of the final hearing, I walked into the courthouse feeling a surge of nervous energy. I had my attorney by my side, and I felt prepared. My soon-to-be ex-wife arrived looking disheveled and panicked. My brother wasn't present, but I assumed that was to avoid facing the fallout directly. The judge called our case, and I stepped forward. My wife stood on the opposite side, handshaking as her attorney tried to paint her as a victim of marital discord. They even attempted to argue that my brother's involvement was a brief lapse in judgment, implying that I should still provide financial support since the child would be born during our marriage. But my attorney was ready. He presented the paternity test, the proof of adultery, and the messages that indicated they'd been seeing each other for quite some time. When my wife's attorney tried to pivot, claiming emotional distress, the judge cut through the noise. Legally, the test results were irrefutable. The judge stated that I was not obligated to support a child that was proven not to be mine, especially under these circumstances. Furthermore, the evidence of infidelity gave me strong grounds for an at-fault divorce, severely weakening her claim for spousal support. I glanced at my wife. She looked defeated, tears streaming down her cheeks. Maybe she realized how badly she'd overplayed her hand, thinking she could manipulate me forever. The judge, in a firm but measured tone, explained that while the court sympathized with her upcoming parenthood, she'd have to address any financial or support issues with a biological father, my brother. Hearing that was a moment of pure, grim satisfaction. I got exactly what I wanted, a final decree of divorce, zero obligation toward child support, and no spousal support beyond a minimal settlement that was standard in these cases, just enough to cover the simplest legal formalities. When it was over, I walked out of the courtroom feeling like a massive weight had been lifted off my chest. I had stood my ground, refused to be used, and emerged vindicated. My wife tried to catch me in the hallway, but I strode past her. She called out, saying she was sorry, that she was lost, that she made a mistake. I didn't even turn around. Mistakes happen once, maybe twice, but this was a sustained, deliberate betrayal. She had no right to my sympathy. I got into my car and drove off, determined to start fresh. Over the following weeks, I heard bits and pieces about her situation. She moved in temporarily with an old friend. My brother apparently ghosted her, refusing to take calls, not wanting to accept responsibility for the pregnancy he helped cause. Rumor had it that my parents were torn, but my father made it clear to my brother that if he didn't step up for the child, he wasn't welcome at their house. My mother, ever the peacemaker, attempted to facilitate some kind of conversation between my brother and my ex-wife, but I stayed out of it. It was their bed. They could lie in it. Despite everything I did, feel a pang of sadness for the baby. The child was innocent, stuck with a father who tried to dodge accountability and a mother who was willing to lie about paternity. But I couldn't carry that burden. I had done enough emotional heavy lifting. The sense of justice I felt for standing up for myself outweighed the lingering heartbreak. In my mind, I labeled the final step as revenge, though it wasn't about petty payback. It was about ensuring they reaped the consequences of their actions. They had tried to corner me, use me as a scapegoat for their betrayal, and expected me to roll over financially. Instead, I used the legal system to defend myself. Now my wife was cut off from my income, and my brother faced a massive responsibility he'd been scrambling to avoid. Their manipulative efforts backfired spectacularly. A few relatives reached out, expressing shock and asking for my side of the story. I was honest but kept the details minimal, explaining that I'd won my case and was free to move on. Some took pity on my ex-wife, claiming she was facing a hard life as a single mother. Others condemned her actions outright. I didn't want to get caught in the middle of family drama anymore. My part was done. It felt surreal to return to daily life after so much chaos. I still experienced nightmares and flashes of anger. But each day, the bitterness loosened its grip, replaced by a cautious optimism about the future. I focused on my job, on rebuilding my finances, and on healing emotionally. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if my brother would ever try to apologize properly. Maybe someday he'd realize how deeply he'd shattered our bond. But that was his journey, not mine. When I signed the final divorce papers, I paused for a moment, reflecting on how everything had started. The innocent belief that family always stands by you. The naivete that my marriage was built on trust. It was all gone now. But in its place, I discovered I was stronger than I ever gave myself credit for. I was capable of seeking justice and demanding respect for myself. In the end, I walked away with something more valuable than any settlement: my dignity. I didn't let them make me the fool. While my ex-wife and brother grappled with their own consequences, I took the chance to rebuild from scratch. I wouldn't say it was a happy ending, exactly, but it was a liberating one. I was free, with a clean slate, and I didn't owe them a single thing. Looking back, I see a painful chapter in my life, a chapter brimming with deceit and betrayal. But I also see a turning point, a moment where I decided I wasn't going to let anyone trample over me. And that, I think, was the biggest victory. If there's one takeaway from it all, it's that sometimes you have to confront the ugliest truths to protect your own future. People who betray your trust might try every entitled trick in the book, but if you stand firm and gather the right support, you can rise above the wreckage they leave behind. That's where I am now, moving forward, refusing to be defined by their actions, and stepping into the next phase of my life with the knowledge that I am stronger, wiser, and no longer bound by the lies of the past.